Hi, I'm Blake Lively, and I'm going to be taking the BuzzFeed quiz, which iconic Blake Lively character.
Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni were never the kind of co-stars people expected to question, at least not in this way, not in a way where the conversation isn't built around something obvious like a public argument or a dramatic fallout, but instead around something far quieter, something harder to define, the kind of tension that doesn't announce itself but slowly becomes noticeable through what's missing rather than what's present. Because when two actors come together on a project, especially one that draws attention, there's usually a certain energy that naturally forms between them, something easy, something unforced, whether it's in interviews, behind-the-scenes clips, or even small candid moments that fans tend to pick up on, and that energy becomes part of how the project itself is experienced by the audience. But here, with Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni, people have started to notice that something about that expected connection feels different, not dramatically broken, not openly hostile, just absent in a way that's difficult to ignore once you start paying attention, and that absence has slowly turned into curiosity, because in Hollywood, silence can often say more than words ever could, and what stands out the most right now isn't anything either of them has directly said, it's everything they haven't said, the lack of shared interviews, the noticeable distance in public appearances, the way conversations seem to shift or get redirected when one is asked about the other, and at first, it might seem like nothing, just coincidence, just scheduling, just the normal unpredictability of media appearances, but when those patterns repeat, when the same kind of distance keeps showing up again and again, it stops feeling accidental and starts to feel intentional, and that's when people begin asking questions, not out of negativity, but out of curiosity, trying to understand whether what they're seeing is just a misinterpretation or something more real, something happening behind the scenes that hasn't been openly addressed, because the truth is, when co-stars are genuinely on good terms, there's usually a rhythm to how they interact, a natural back and forth, shared humor, mutual appreciation that doesn't feel forced. Even in the most structured interviews, there are small moments that reveal comfort and alignment, but in this case, that rhythm feels slightly off, like something has interrupted the flow, replacing it with a more careful, more measured dynamic, and it's not that they can't interact, it's that when they do, it feels controlled, almost like both sides are aware of how everything might be perceived and are choosing to stay within certain boundaries, and that awareness itself becomes part of the story, because it suggests that whatever is happening, whether it's big or small, is being managed in a very deliberate way. And that kind of management doesn't usually come out of nowhere, it often points to a shift. Something that changed over time, even if that change wasn't dramatic enough to become public, and when people look back at earlier moments, earlier interviews or appearances, there's a noticeable difference in tone, a time when everything seemed more relaxed, more collaborative, when the focus was clearly on the project rather than on analyzing the relationship between the people involved, but somewhere along the way, that focus began to shift, slowly at first, almost unnoticeably, until it reached a point where the dynamic itself became part of the conversation, and once that happens, it's very difficult to reverse, because every new appearance, every new clip, every new interaction gets viewed through that same lens of curiosity, and even the smallest detail can take on more meaning than it normally would, and that's exactly what seems to be happening here. People are watching more closely, listening more carefully, trying to pick up on things that might confirm or explain what they're sensing. And at the same time, both Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni appear to be maintaining a level of professionalism that keeps everything from crossing into anything openly negative. There are no public statements, no direct comments that would clearly define the situation, just a consistent sense of distance that continues to raise questions without ever fully answering them, and in a way, that makes the situation even more intriguing, because it exists in that space between certainty and speculation, where nothing is confirmed but nothing feels entirely imagined either, and that space is where most modern celebrity narratives tend to live, shaped as much by observation and interpretation as by actual events, and it's important to understand that in an industry like Hollywood, dynamics like this are not always simple, they're rarely just about liking or disliking someone, there are layers to it. Professional expectations, creative differences, personal boundaries, public image considerations, all of these factors can influence how people interact, especially when those interactions are constantly being watched and analyzed by millions of people, and sometimes, what looks like tension from the outside is actually just distance created for practical reasons, differences in schedules, different approaches to promotion, or even just personality differences that don't naturally align in a public setting, but at the same time, it would be unrealistic to assume that every noticeable shift is purely coincidental, because in an environment where everything is carefully planned and managed, patterns tend to have reasons behind them, even if those reasons are never openly discussed, and that's where the speculation begins to branch out. Some people believe that this could simply be a case of two individuals who don't naturally connect beyond their work, which is not uncommon. Not every co-star becomes close, not every collaboration leads to a lasting friendship, and in many cases, professionalism is enough to carry things forward without any issues, but others think there may be more to it, something that changed the dynamic in a more specific way, whether it was a disagreement, a difference in creative vision, or even something related to how the project itself was handled, because those kinds of factors can quietly influence how people interact moving forward, creating a distance that isn't dramatic but is still noticeable. And then there's another perspective entirely, one that looks at the situation from a more strategic angle, suggesting that what appears to be tension might actually be part of a larger narrative being shaped around the project, because in today's media environment, attention is everything, and sometimes the most effective way to generate attention is not through clear answers, but through unanswered questions, through moments that make people curious enough to keep watching, keep discussing, keep speculating. But even that explanation doesn't fully account for the consistency of what people are noticing, because if it were purely strategic, there would likely be more variation, more moments designed to shift the narrative back and forth, and instead, what stands out is how steady the distance seems to be, which brings everything back to the possibility that there is something real at the center of it, something that both sides are choosing not to define publicly, and that choice, whether intentional or simply necessary, is what keeps the situation in this ongoing state of uncertainty, where nothing is confirmed, nothing is denied, and everything exists somewhere in between. And as long as that remains the case, the conversation will continue, not because of any single dramatic moment, but because of the subtle, persistent feeling that there's more to the story than what's being shown. And as this quiet narrative continues to build, it starts to reflect something much bigger than just the dynamic between two co-stars. It becomes a window into how relationships in Hollywood often function behind the scenes, where things are not always as straightforward as they appear on screen or even in carefully structured interviews, because what audiences see is only a fraction of the full picture, a version that has already been filtered, shaped, and presented in a way that aligns with a certain image, and when that image starts to feel slightly out of sync with what people are observing, even in small ways, it naturally leads to questions, not necessarily because people are looking for drama, but because humans are wired to notice patterns, to sense when something doesn't quite match expectations, and that's exactly what's happening here. The expectation was simple: two co-stars promoting a project together, showing a level of connection that supports the story they're telling. But instead, what people are seeing feels more distant, more individual, almost as if both Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni are moving along parallel paths rather than a shared one, and that distinction, subtle as it may seem, is enough to keep the conversation going, because it introduces a sense of imbalance, a feeling that something is slightly off, even if it's never clearly defined. And the interesting part is how both of them seem to be handling it, not by addressing it directly, not by trying to shut down speculation in a clear or confrontational way, but by continuing forward with a kind of quiet control, focusing on their work, their individual appearances, their own narratives, while allowing the space between them to remain exactly as it is. And that approach says a lot, because it suggests an understanding of how quickly things can escalate once they are given a clear label. Once a situation is defined in a way that can be easily shared and amplified, and by avoiding that, they maintain a level of flexibility, a way to move forward without being tied to a specific narrative. But at the same time, that lack of clarity becomes its own kind of story, one that grows through interpretation rather than confirmation, and that's where the audience plays a role, because the more people watch, the more they analyze, the more the narrative expands, shaped by countless perspectives, each one adding another layer to something that may or may not be as complex as it seems. And in that sense, the situation becomes less about finding a single answer and more about understanding how these kinds of dynamics are perceived, how easily silence can be interpreted as tension, how quickly distance can be seen as conflict, especially in an environment where every detail is magnified and every interaction is viewed through a lens of expectation. And it's also worth considering the pressure that comes with that level of visibility, because for actors like Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni, every move is observed, every word is analyzed, and even the choice to say nothing can become a statement in itself, which means that maintaining any kind of personal boundary becomes increasingly difficult, especially when those boundaries are mistaken for something else, something more dramatic, more intentional, more meaningful than they might actually be, and yet, at the same time, it's impossible to completely dismiss the idea that there could be something real behind the distance, because as much as perception can shape a narrative, it usually starts with something, even if that something is small, even if it's just a difference in perspective or a moment that shifted the tone in a way that only those involved fully understand, and that's often how these situations exist, not as clear-cut stories with defined beginnings and endings, but as ongoing dynamics that evolve over time, influenced by both internal and external factors, and in this case, the external factor is the attention itself, the growing awareness, the constant discussion, which in turn can influence how both individuals choose to interact moving forward, creating a cycle where perception and behavior continuously shape each other, and that cycle is what keeps the situation alive, what prevents it from fading into the background like so many other passing observations, because as long as there are no clear answers, there is always room for interpretation, always another angle to consider, another detail to revisit, another possibility to explore. And that's what turns something subtle into something significant, not necessarily because of what is happening, but because of how it is being experienced and discussed, and in the end, the question of whether everything is okay between Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni may never have a simple or public answer. It may remain one of those stories that exists in fragments, in observations, in the space between what is shown and what is understood, and maybe that's what makes it so compelling, not the certainty, but the uncertainty, the feeling that there is something just out of reach, something that can be sensed but not fully explained, and as long as that feeling remains, the conversation will continue, evolving with every new appearance, every new interview, every new moment that either adds to the mystery or quietly reshapes it, keeping people watching, thinking, and trying to piece together a story that may never be fully told, but will always be interesting because of the way it exists, somewhere between reality and perception, clarity and ambiguity, presence and absence, and in that space, it becomes more than just a question about two co-stars, it becomes a reflection of how we interpret the world we see, especially when that world is carefully curated, carefully controlled, and yet still capable of revealing more than it intends, one subtle detail at a time.